Okay, so just have one thing on the agenda today, really, which is talking about some of the evidence on the potential impacts of climate change on health. In terms of the exams, the majority of them are graded, but we're still working on them, so I think probably Wednesday I should have them back to you guys. And then I'll probably post a problem set either today or tomorrow, which we do probably like maybe next Wednesday. So if you have any questions, you can come to my office hours either on Thursday or on Monday. In terms of the rest of the semester, so we're going to talk. So we'll talk about like climate change impacts on health. We'll talk a little bit about, focus like a little bit to the next lecture is going to be on the impacts of like, I guess we call it the built environment on health, but really like the impacts of like fast food on health, which is another research area that I've been involved in. So I'll talk about one of my own papers there, and then some other papers on like some of the calorie posting stuff. There's also, right now there's like this soda tax that's going through, so maybe I'll pull in a little bit about that as well. There's been a couple papers written about that more on the state level and at the local level. And then I think after that we'll start shifting into kind of the last section of the course, which is more about the healthcare system. So sort of like what looking at how much we spend on healthcare, why, and like sort of what kind of return we get. So how well do we do it actually? How well do we do actually producing good health outcomes in terms of our healthcare spending? So for today, what I'm going to talk about is essentially a paper that looks at measuring kind of the effect of relatively short-run fluctuations in weather on population health. So I think it's pretty clear right now that climate change is sort of the leading environmental issue of the day. It's something that probably won't affect most of us all that to that great degree. But if you sort of look over a horizon of 50 or 100 years or more, that's probably the preeminent issue, and that's why people are talking about it today. So I think obviously there's always some holdouts, but I think even most skeptics at this point would concede that the planet is warming. Some people will dispute whether or not the cause is actually whether the warming is actually due to human activity. So documenting the first stage in understanding climate change is to document that the planet is in fact getting warmer. I think again that's like there's an abundance of evidence that that's true. The fact that it is getting warmer, though, you could still argue. So I think if you were somebody who didn't believe in climate change, I think for a while, that camp or whatever was basically arguing that they didn't even think the planet was getting warmer. Now, for the most part, people can see that. You could still though believe that human activity might not be the main causal factor. So the question is, were we not emitting carbon, would the planet still have been getting warmer anyway? And that's much harder to definitively prove because if you think about how we've talked about trying to measure causal effects in this class. So this question you could view it as basically, is there do human carbon emissions have a causal effect on global temperatures, basically? And if you think about how we've talked about measuring causal effects in this class, it's basically come down to trying to either run a field experiment, run a randomized controlled trial, or find some sort of natural experiment that maybe approximates a randomized controlled trial. So in this context, what a randomized controlled trial would involve, it would be to get 100 planet Earths and randomly assign 50 of them to have higher carbon emissions and randomly assign 50 of them to not have higher carbon emissions and track temperatures for several hundred years and see whether or not the planet warms. Needless to say, that is not going to happen, nor is any sort of natural experiment analog of that going to happen because you just have one planet. So essentially, for measuring with the outcome that you're interested in is kind of global temperature, which is what we're interested in here. Measuring that outcome necessarily implies that you can never have a sample of more than one, given that we just have one planet. So you can't really apply any of the empirical tools that we talked about in this class. So absent that, you basically have to kind of fall back on the models that climate scientists have built and sort of the basic principle. I mean, we know that carbon dioxide does help retain solar heat that comes from the sun. So there, at some level of carbon emissions, the basic science tells you that you would have to have, the planet would have to get warmer. Whether or not we're exactly at a level where the total stock of carbon emissions that we've emitted necessarily is leading to the temperature increases that we've seen. We can't know for sure. But I think the sort of evidence based on at least the models is strongly suggestive that human carbon emissions do play a substantial role in the planetary warming we've seen. So that being said, most climate models predict not just that the average temperatures will rise, but actually that fluctuations will become more severe. So, in some places temperatures could potentially fall. So I've heard forecasts that in San Francisco in particular, it might not get warmer just because the way that the weather systems work in California is that when it gets really warm in the Central Valley, that draws in colder air from the Pacific, which doesn't really have anywhere to go for most of the coast because there's mountains, but it can get through the Golden Gate, and so that's why you get all this fog in the summer in San Francisco. So potentially, as the Central Valley gets even warmer, San Francisco might get even colder, which somebody who lives in San Francisco is not something I would look forward to during the summer, but it would be after I'm dead anyway, so it's probably not really going to affect me. But in general, so it's not just that the planet's getting warmer, but potentially you're going to see sort of more severe fluctuations. So you could have more heat waves. Certainly, you might even in some cases have more extreme cold events. And so if we want to think about the implications of an increase in fluctuations in weather on human health, that's something that we could actually potentially estimate just using the variation in weather that we have available, because we do observe heat waves, we do observe cold snaps, and we could look and try to measure what the effects of these types of extreme events are on human health. So the good news in this context is that short-term fluctuations in weather are basically as good as randomly assigned, right? So weather is something that we don't think is going to be generated by any sort of human activity except over the very long scale. So we are talking about climate change and global warming, and so we could imagine that what we're doing today does have an impact on future weather events decades from now. But it's almost certain that no matter how much carbon or other pollutants we emit today is not going to have any impact on whether or not the San Francisco Bay Area experiences a heat wave next week or not, right? That's going to just be a purely random event. And so although certainly so when you think about variation in weather, it's important to think about really sort of the two dimensions on which weather can vary. So the first dimension is basically the cross-sectional dimension. So as you go to different places have different types of weather, right? So we almost never get snow here, but if you go up to Canada or the Northeast or basically the rest of the U.S., you will experience snow during the winter. So certainly if you think about average temperatures during the winter, there's extreme variation spatially. San Diego or Los Angeles might be in the 60s or 70s, and in Minnesota it might be 20 degrees below zero or something like that, right? Same thing with heat. Some places get much warmer than other places. So there's a lot of variation in weather across on the spatial dimension, basically what we're calling cross-sectional dimension, and then of course there's also variation in weather temporally. So not so much in terms of very long run differences. So like there's not, again, the planet is getting somewhat warmer every year on average, but if you're looking over say a 10 or 20 year period, you're not going to see a really large or really substantial trend in weather. But certainly from year to year and from month to month, there's a lot of variation in what the temperature is and what precipitation is. And so you can sort of think about decomposing the variation, the overall variation weather, into this cross-sectional dimension, and then into basically fluctuations from season to season or from month to month or year to year over time. And the important thing is that if you want to think about sort of what type of variation you could use to estimate a causal effect of weather on a particular outcome, in this case health, what you're going to want to use is the variation that you observe in weather at a given location over time, and you're probably going to want to also deseasonalize that. So remember, like the idea here is that you want to get fluctuations in weather that you could view as being almost as good as randomly assigned. So that's going to rule out really sort of two primary types of two types of variation in weather. So the first type is that spatial variation that we talked about. You certainly could compare like you could sort of look at how people do in Boston over the winter where it gets relatively cold versus how people do in Los Angeles over the winter where it doesn't get very cold. And if you see increased mortality in Boston, then you might assume like, oh, that means that being in very cold environments is bad for your health because people are dying at high rates. That might be true, but it also just might be the case that there's a lot of differences in the populations between Boston and Los Angeles, right? So the ethnic distributions are different, the age distributions are different, the sort of types of jobs people are doing are different, and all sorts of other differences. So you wouldn't really want to interpret any of the relationships that you observe between weather and mortality using that cross-sectional variation weather as being necessarily like causal relationships. So you don't want to use a cross-sectional variation. You also do not want to use like basically seasonal variation. So if you observe, so you might observe like, so you say, okay, well I don't want to use any cross-sectional variation, right? So I'm going to focus on like particular cities and just look at fluctuations in weather over time. And so if you did if you had like temperature on the y-axis and basically time on the x-axis, and you were looking pretty much anywhere, but certainly if you look more towards like the south or basically like outside of California where we have relatively mild weather, you're going to see a pattern over time that's going to look something like this, right? Where this is like average temperature, you're going to see it fall during the winters and then reach its maximum during the summers and so forth. So this would basically be from peak to peak or trough to trough. It's going to be like a 1 year period the way that I'm drawing this figure, right? So you can think, well, I'm going to use then this variation in weather that I observe over time to estimate the effect of weather on health outcomes. And what I'll observe is that in the winter, temperatures are much colder. In the summer, temperatures are much hotter. And then maybe the spring and the fall is sort of intermediate, relatively mild. And so if I observe like say higher mortality rates during the summer or during the winter, then I will conclude that either very high temperatures are unhealthy for you or very low temperatures are unhealthy for you, or both. You're sort of that mortality increases both sort of at the bottom and the top here relative to the middle seasons. So that might be tempting, but again, you're probably going to have issues there. Like you could definitely tell omitted variables by stories that might generate those results. So it wouldn't necessarily have to represent a causal effect, right? So during the summer, school tends to be out of session. People are on vacation. We know that pollution levels are different just because weather itself has an effect on pollution. And so there's sort of a lot of things that, although actually forget the pollution because you could argue that would in fact be an effect of if weather increases pollution and then pollution increases mortality, you would argue that's actually a causal effect of weather and pollution, just a mechanism. So let's just say like you're on summer break. You might be going like skydiving or rock climbing or other relatively hazardous activities, and you might be driving a lot more, which is also really exposing to risks and so forth. So there's all sorts of like differences in sort of the activities that people are doing, and whether or not they're working, whether or not they're in school, and so forth. That might cause mortality rates to be higher in the summer than during say like spring or fall. Now you can say, well, the stories you were telling were just like about you have some sort of like skydiving accident. Obviously, I could look at the cause of death, and I know that's not going to be attributable to weather, but you can always tell something that's more nuanced. Like, okay, well, now you're running in marathons, and you guys in your 20s, so you're fine. But if you're like in your 50s or something, and maybe you have some heart disease, that could trigger like a heart attack, and you wouldn't have observed that during the spring or the fall when you weren't doing these activities. So basically, the bottom line is probably using the seasonal variation in weather is not going to be all that attractive as an estimation strategy. So using like the seasonal variation in weather to estimate the effect of weather mortality is not going to be that attractive as an estimation technique because it's still not really random whether you're looking at summer versus looking at the winter versus looking at spring or fall. So ideally, what you actually want to use and what the paper that we're going to discuss does use is sort of looking at a given place in time and then looking at within a given season, observing whether or not there's sort of fluctuations from seasonal norms. Right. So I drew this relationship between temperature and time as being sort of like very deterministic and having no random component to it. But in fact, in reality, so this is going to represent sort of the average temperature, your expectation of how the temperature should vary over season. But in reality, you have an exceptionally warm summer, an exceptionally cool summer, same thing for the winter. And so sort of the actual weather probably looks something more like this. The actual temperature looks something more like this, where there's kind of this randomness around like this relatively smooth underlying relationship between the season and the temperature. And so what you're going to want to do is essentially use the variation that arises because you're having like exceptionally cool summer month or an exceptionally warm summer month or an exceptionally warm winter month or an exceptionally like cool winter month. Basically see how those deviations from the mean temperature in that particular season in that particular location, how those deviations relate to changes in health, and in this case like changes in hospitalizations or mortality. So at that point, when you're thinking about like a particular month or in a particular location being basically like randomly hotter or randomly colder just because it happens, the weather happened to be a little bit weird this month. At that point, you can think of that shock as being as good as randomly assigned in the sense that it's unclear how it would be related to anything else that might determine mortality other than things that would in fact be caused by the weather fluctuation itself, right? So if it turns out that there's like this extreme cold blizzard and people end up like crashing on the roads at higher frequencies because there's so much ice or something like that, that would in fact be an effect of the extreme weather condition in the sense that the ice caused people to crash, and then that increased the number of hospitalizations or the number of road traffic fatalities. So you can think of things that would be related to the weather that could affect health, but in almost all cases, they'd be related to weather because the weather was actually having a causal effect on that factor. Okay, so that's kind of the like intuition or the motivation behind the regressions and like the research design that this paper uses. So what they're going to try to do is then estimate the effect of these fluctuations within a given location during a given season or a given month really on human health, and their outcome that they're going to use is mortality. So they're actually looking at like death rates here. So they want to test whether extreme weather events will affect mortality, and the reason or the motivating facts I think behind the paper are that you will often read sort of reports of like excess deaths following either heat waves or sometimes cold snaps. So I don't know, I think like maybe around the time they wrote this, this was like several years ago, but I think there had been like a huge heat wave in Europe during like the summer. And so you actually read in the newspaper, they would say something like, epidemiologists estimated that there were 3,000 additional deaths that had occurred because of the heat wave. Actually figuring out whether or not somebody died because of the heat wave is it's not as straightforward as you might think, right? So somebody gets admitted to the hospital, they might have symptoms that you think are sort of exacerbated by extreme heat, if they're like in respiratory distress or something. And so you maybe, you certainly might suspect that heat played a role in their death, but you're not able to observe the counterfactual state of the world where it hadn't been hot, and they might or might not still have come into the hospital in respiratory death, right? So when we're talking about sort of like cause of death, it is something that will get written on their death certificates, and the coroner will try to make some judgment. But in many cases, it's not going to be clear with certainty whether or not that person would have died had there not been a heat wave. So what they want to do is try to get an estimate of, at least on average, whether or not mortality increases or decreases or is unchanged during these types of extreme weather events. So they're going to just look at the U.S., which I think is, obviously it's the reason they're doing that is because they have the data available and because they're in the U.S., so it's of course relevant from their perspective. I don't know that it's like sort of the most. It's probably if you're thinking of where you're going to potentially find impacts, I think the developed countries are the last place that you would think, just because people have more of an ability to potentially adapt to changes in temperature. So in particular, like a lot of people, especially in regions that get hot, will have air conditioning, and in regions that get cold, will have heating. And so in principle, you should be able to protect yourself from these extreme weather events if you're able to stay in climate-controlled areas. Whereas if you go to a developing country, people might not have sufficient air conditioning. Well, certainly they cannot have air conditioning, and they might not have heating unless they're in an area that gets really cold. So the types of adaptations that people can engage in are more limited in developing countries, and then of course also you have like a more limited healthcare system in those countries, so the potential to treat it is also lower. So I think that you would think of sort of the estimates that they're gonna come up with as kind of being like lower bounds of the effects that you might expect if you were to look in countries that were less developed than say the U.S. So initially, they're just going to graph mortality by the day of the year, and what you'll see here in a second is that there is a strong tendency or a strong trend towards higher mortality during the winter, which is suggestive evidence that maybe extreme cold events do have a negative impact, or just cold in general has a negative impact on health. But again, you could tell stories about how people are engaging in different activities during winter. It's like the holidays, everybody lets themselves go. They all start eating things that are bad for you and drinking and engaging in other risky behaviors and so forth, and so that could just have an impact on like cardiovascular disease in general. So they test whether or not they're going to test whether or not extreme weather events affect mortality. And so this is just looking at the mortality rate by basically day of the year. So I think 0 is like from January, and then 360 would be out, 365 would be out towards December. And so you can see here that it does seem like the mortality rate is elevated. The mortality rate for 100,000 people. It does seem like it's elevated during the winter months. So from I guess like about January to probably around March at the beginning, and then maybe November, December, you can see it's above average, and then during the summer it's basically below average. So there's like a 0 is essentially the mean because it's all relative to whatever the mean mortality rate is. Obviously you can't have like a negative mortality rate, so it's just negative. It's just depressed relative to whatever the mean is. So if you just looked at this, at this graph, you would probably think that maybe heat is good for you and cold is bad for you. And if you actually look at sort of what the underlying causes of death are there that are generating those patterns, what you would see is that cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease, mortality for those two diseases tend to be like strongly seasonal, whereas neoplasms, which are cancer, the mortality for those diseases is not, which again is, I think it's kind of consistent with what you might believe just from a simple like standpoint of biology, that if you have heart disease or some sort of respiratory disease, that's the type of disease where if you sort of get hit with a negative shock, you could expect that could trigger a heart attack or something like that. Whereas if you're just looking at cancer, that's something that's probably going to kind of grow and metastasize independent of what the external environment that you're in is. So you would tend to think that the former would be more seasonal than the latter. But it's still not clear that the seasonal pattern necessarily represents a causal relationship. It suggests that cold days are bad for you and warm days are not. But there's a lot of things that vary across the season. So daylight hours vary with the season, and that in turn changes people's activities. And then as we discussed, like, work schedules and vacations and holidays and so forth also have a strong seasonal component, and those could all potentially have some sort of impact on mortality. So what Deschênes and Marty do is they compare mortality patterns between, just as sort of a first cut of the data, what they do is compare mortality patterns between Suffolk County, Massachusetts, so that's basically like Boston area, versus San Diego County, California, so obviously it's the San Diego area. And what you find is that San Diego displays a much weaker seasonal pattern in mortality than Suffolk County. So the winter increase in mortality rates is lower in San Diego, although the difference isn't as large as you might expect. So Boston has much more extreme seasons than San Diego, particularly like the winter is much worse. So I went to school in Boston, MIT, and for graduate school, and I remember like one winter, there was like the apartment that I shared with several other graduate students. We had like 3 or 4 bedrooms, and just the way it was laid out, like my bedroom happened to have a door, like an exterior door that went onto like a balcony, and the door was actually like very well weatherproof. It had like pretty good seals and so forth, and we didn't use it, so like my bed was actually just pushed up against it. It was effectively just treated as part of the wall. And so I remember there was like one night when it was snowing, and I think the winds must have been gusting up to like 50 miles an hour or something like that. And so later in the evening, when I went back to my room, a small pile of snow had started to accumulate on my bed because it was basically being forced in by the wind to